Well, welcome back to our study of the confession. And if you have your confessions, you can go to chapter 19, and we're going to be reading paragraph or sections 3 to 5. So we'll cover chapters or sections 3, 4, and 5. And then next week we will finish out the section on, or chapter 19, dealing with the law. And before we begin, let me pray, and then we'll read and work our way through. So let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you once again for this time, and we ask that as we turn to this confession and study the law, your law, I pray that you would give us wisdom, and that you would, again, use it to build us up in faith, renew our minds, and help us to be conformed all the more into the image of Christ. And we ask this in his name. Amen. Again, we are continuing the study of chapter 19. If you remember last week, we talked about the moral law, and we did I gave a sort of threefold division, and it's not mine, obviously it's been used even in the confession and historically, a threefold division of the law into, when we look at the Old Testament law, it's historically been divided into three divisions, and it's moral law. You can look at the Ten Commandments as a sort of summary of the moral law. You have the judicial law, the laws for the nation of Israel, and the ceremonial law, the laws for worship. And of course, these aren't always cut and clear cut to which laws go to. Does it fall under moral or judicial or ceremonial or both or multiple? But it's a helpful distinction to make. And we see this distinction even in chapter 19. And so last week, in the first two paragraphs, we looked at the moral law. And we saw that was the law that was written on the heart of man at creation and summarized again in the Ten Commandments. And the moral law is forever binding on all men. And we'll see that in section 5. But this evening, we're going to look at specifically ceremonial and judicial law. And so let's read section 3 of the confession. It says this: "Besides this law, commonly called the moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel, as a church under age, ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth divers instructions of moral duties, all which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament." Now, as the confession states here, not only did God give Israel this moral law, but he also gave them ceremonial laws. Ceremonial laws. And we see these laws largely laid out in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and again repeated in Deuteronomy. And the confession notes that these ceremonial laws were typical. Now, it doesn't mean that these were just some humdrum laws. It's not saying these are just typical laws, No, that's not what it means. It is using the word typical in a specific way. In a sense that these laws, these ceremonial laws, were types or symbols which pointed forward to Christ. And as we will see, these laws that typified Christ, they pointed forward to him, these have been abrogated. They have faded away with the reality of the person and work of Christ. And we might use the language, sometimes the New Testament will even use this language of shadow and reality to describe things in the law that typified, they pointed forward to Christ. Those were the shadows, but of course Christ is the reality. Now, these types were of two kinds, as the confession mentions. The first one the confession mentions, the ceremonial laws, were the ceremonial laws that dealt with worship. And specifically, that these ceremonial laws prefigured Christ, his grace, his actions, sufferings, and benefits. Now, all of Israel's laws prefigured or pointed forward to Christ, all of these ceremonial laws. And that you just read through the book of Hebrews and you can see this all over the place. It's making this same point. Think of Hebrews chapter 5. Describes the priest, quote, serving as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Or chapter 10, verse 1 describes it. For since the law had but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. End quote. Not only did it simply point forward to Christ, but if you can remember all the way back in chapter 8 of the Confession, section 6, the Confession says, not only to point forward to Christ, but the, quote, virtue, efficacy, and benefits of Christ were communicated unto the elect in all ages successfully from the beginning of the world, in and by those types and sacrifices wherein he was revealed. So Christ, in other words, has always been communicated to his church. It's not like you were under the Old Testament and you had, under these types and shadows, the sacrificial system, you had this way of salvation. And now in the New Testament, you have the way of Christ as salvation. No, the Confession makes clear that Christ was communicated to his church in the Old Testament through promises, types, and sacrifices, wherein he was revealed. Chapter 8, section 6. And the glory of the New Testament is that the reality of Jesus has come, and so these things that pointed forward to these types have gone away, and we now see him with clarity. Now, these types and shadows in Israel's ceremonial laws both communicated Christ to them, but it also pointed forward to his person and work, right? There was a future. There was a time where he's going to come. We have these shadows. The reality will be here. And think of the whole sacrificial cult system, the whole worship of Israel, right? You had the spotless lamb that would be sacrificed on behalf of the sins of the worshiper. You had the worshiper who would lay his hands upon the lamb, that's signifying that he is identifying with the lamb, this spotless lamb that was going to take his place. You had the priest who stood as a sort of mediator who would then take the animal and cut its throat, signifying the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins. Because this is, if one was to approach God in worship, sin needed to be dealt with. And so you had the priest, you had the worshiper, you had the animal, you had God, all of these parties, and this whole sacrificial system pointed forward to the person and work of Christ. And we could even say this was done at the temple, which also pointed forward. And we use the language that these are fulfilled in Christ, but we might ask how specifically. Well, think of the parties that were involved that we just mentioned. First, Jesus, since he is fully God, he represents, at least in this system, God. He is God. He is also fully man, so he can represent the worshiper. He's also the true high priest who offers sacrifices on behalf of his people. And he's not only the high priest, but he's also the spotless lamb, the sacrifice who gets up onto the altar to offer himself as the perfect sacrifice for sin. And to even throw in another thing, he is the true temple. So you can see all of these. Think of the sacrificial system. You have God, you have the worshiper, you have the priest, you have the animal, and you have the temple. And all of these typified and pointed forward to Christ. And Christ embodies all of them. Right? Christ is the Word became flesh who tabernacled among us. And it's in him that the fullness of deity dwells bodily. So all of Israel's ceremonial laws, their temple worship, their sacrifices, pointed forward to Christ. Of course, you go on even to the various cleansing rituals, the washings. They pointed forward to Christ's benefits. He was going to bring what the spotless lamb could not bring. He's going to bring the washing away of sins. So they pointed forward to him. Now, second, the confession in this section also mentions how these ceremonial laws also held forth various instructions for moral duties. In other words, there was moral principles communicated in these as well. All right, for example, Israel was taught that through sacrifice, the sacrifice that they offered, they were to take their sin seriously. There's a moral principle being communicated. You see this lamb and you see its throat slit. This is serious business. They need to take their sin seriously. Or think of the commands to keep separate the clean and unclean foods or animals, whatever it is. And so that communicated to them a moral principle that they were to be a holy nation and they were to not order their lives as these evil nations did. Think of Paul. He uses this example in 1 Corinthians 5, where he says in verses 6 and 7, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump as you really are unleavened." Right? He's drawing on this ceremonial law in order to make a moral argument to the people that you are to be separate. Separate yourselves from this evil. So there's moral duties that can be learned from some of these ceremonial laws. Now the section ends stating that all of these ceremonial laws are abrogated under the New Testament. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we just didn't like them, and so we scrap those, kind of out with the old, in with the new, but rather that Christ has fulfilled these laws. He is the reality that they pointed to. It's not because they were bad, but Christ fulfilled them. I've used the language before. Think of like scaffolding and a building. Right? You'll use the scaffolding as you're building the building, but then as soon as the building is done, the reality is here, the scaffolding falls away. Right? There's no need for it any longer. All right, let's look at section 4, judicial law. Section 4 says this: "To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require." Now, so we've moral law, ceremonial law, now we're looking at judicial law. And you remember that these are the laws that govern the state of Israel, right? These were their political laws. And when the nation of Israel, which also typified Christ, when that nation expired, the confession says that these laws concerning their political affairs, these also expired. However, the confession does note that there is some abiding nature in these judicial laws that were given to Israel. Right? It's not they're not just gone all wholesale, but it says that there is an abiding nature through the applying the general equity of these laws. Now, this means that Christians should not look at the judicial laws and simply dismiss them out of hand, thinking that these laws have no longer any use at all. No, that's not what the confession is saying. And this is what we see in the New Testament authors doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 8 to 10. Paul says, "Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Does he not certainly speak for our sake?" End quote. Paul uses Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, as an argument for paying your pastor. That is what he's talking about. And he uses this law of muzzling an ox when it's treading out the grain. Don't muzzle it. And he takes the moral principle from that, and he uses it to argue for paying their pastors. And that's an important thing. Notice how Paul is using this law. He looks at the law and he looks at what is the moral principle that is embedded, that is articulated in this specific civil code, and he takes it and he applies this same principle in a different situation. And you might notice that what Paul's doing is simply applying the 8th commandment. Right? This is sort of the positive side of do not steal. The positive way of looking at it would be to apply it saying you should pay someone their due. That's the positive way of stating the 8th commandment, as we looked at last week. And so here he applies the general equity of the law to various situations. Now we could put this differently. This sort of idea of general equity is another form or term for moral or natural law. And this moral or natural law is clarified, summarized again, right, in the 10 Commandments. That's not like a The moral law, yes, is inscribed on all human hearts, but it's far more clear when it's written down and given to us in the Ten Commandments. And so though the specific application of certain judicial laws may have expired, the moral principle embedded within them remains. Calvin describes such a connection in this way. He says this, quote, "It is certain that the law of God, which we call moral, is no other than a declaration of natural law, and of that conscience which has been engraven by God on the minds of men, the whole rule of this equity of which we now speak is prescribed in it. This equity, therefore, must alone be the scope and rule and end of all laws." End quote. Or Samuel Rutherford puts it this way, quote, "But we conceive of the whole judicial law as judicial, and as it concerned the republic of the Jews only is abolished, though the moral equity of all these be not abolished." Again, that moral principle that is communicated in these laws remains. And this moral principle is moral law, of course. Now, there's been a great deal of debate on this topic specifically. How do you apply various laws that are not always clear-cut? Nor is it always clear what category a specific law might fall into. Is this moral law? Is it judicial law? Is it ceremonial law? Is it a combination of them? There's been much debate about how specifically to apply these laws throughout even the history of the church. And one of the more recent dust-ups and discussions about how to apply the judicial law of the Old Testament was in the 70s and 80s with a movement called theonomy. And so these would be people like the sort of father of this was Rousas Rushdoony, followed by people such as Gary North, which was his son-in-law, and Greg Bonson. And these are more academic people that were very much articulating this very well, or very clearly, and nowadays there's sort of more popularized versions of it. But the basic idea of theonomy, and before there is a spectrum even within theonomy. It's not like you have the theonomy camp and everybody agrees on all of these things. No, there was much variation even within the theonomists. They weren't always on the same page, but the basic idea is this, that there's the abiding validity of the Mosaic law in exhaustive detail. The abiding validity of the Mosaic, particularly the judicial laws, in exhaustive detail. There is a preference, and I use that word preference specifically, to take essentially the Mosaic law code, and specifically its judicial laws, and essentially move it straight over from Israel to politics today. Specifically, literally, in detail. Often theonomists will see a big overlap or even blend of what has traditionally been called moral law and judicial laws. Right, so they'll just even blend those categories. And so therefore, civil governments today ought to look at the Old Testament judicial code as a template for their own affairs in exhaustive, not just the general equity, but often in details. This is maybe very oversimplistic here, but that's the general idea of theonomy. And before, theonomists, and there's much to disagree with theonomists, but before we just quickly dismiss them, there should be, we have to take care that we don't simply dismiss them because we don't like Old Testament law. That should not be our attitude. When we think about theonomy, it's not just because we don't like the law, it seems a little barbaric or something to us. No, that shouldn't be our attitude at all. We should remember that, as the name suggests, the Old Testament indeed was God's law. These weren't just made up by human beings. These laws were given to Israel by God. And so there's things to be valued from the theonomists that we might disagree, such as their desire and love for God's law and seeking to apply God's law to all of life. That's a commendable thing. Every Christian should affirm that. We want to take God's law seriously and apply it to our lives. Now the how, of course, there's many disagreements. Now, theonomy is very much, it appeals to those who essentially are upset about the squishiness of Christian ethics today, and maybe even understandably so. And theonomy seems to promise sort of clear-cut answers to ethical questions, right? And specifically very complex and difficult ones. But even theonomists, again, differ among themselves on how actually to take the law and apply it. Take these various laws and bring them into today. They did recognize that the importance of taking the principle of the law and taking that over and applying it, but sometimes it can be more literal. But the questions that we might ask theonomists, and even the theonomists themselves dealt with, is how specifically does, if at all, the coming of Christ transform the law? Specifically the judicial laws. What difference does it make that Christ has come when we now come to the judicial law? This is something that they didn't always agree on. And it's actually a very difficult question sometimes. How specifically does this, whatever law it is, how does Christ transform it? There's a general agreement that there is a transformation that takes place. But another question is, how does Israel, moving from a localized theocratic nation to primarily a spiritual community, impact such laws? How does that transition impact the way that we view these laws? Now, some have said that a sort of opposite side of this spectrum would be the views of Meredith Kline. And Kline's basic idea is that the Old Testament canon is not for the Christian church. Now, he doesn't mean that the Old Testament was not in any way inspired God's word. He's not using the word canon in that way. He's using it in a sort of technical sense, but rather that these Old Testament laws are not norms for the Christian church. So sort of, you can kind of hear the opposite side of the theonomists. And he makes a distinction, Kline does, between life norms and faith norms. And so the Old Testament is normative, it is binding, for the faith of New Testament believers, but not for their community life. And as the theonomists say that the Old Testament may be carried over, more or less, from, almost like a straight across, Kline says that the whole Old Testament, the whole of the theocratic nation of Israel was typological to Christ's messianic kingdom, and therefore the judicial laws were all sort of provisional. They're not norms that govern the church. Now, we might say that the theonomists tend to assume judicial law should be applied literally. On the other side, Kline suggests the reverse, that the Old Testament judicial laws ought not to be sought for the norms of Christian life or even society. Now, there's a lot more that we could say on this topic. It's a very big topic. And if you want to read more, there's a good book by Vern Poitras called The Shadow of Christ and the Law of Moses. It's not, it's a pretty thick book. But Poitras, dare I say, takes a sort of third way position, for the lack of a better term. And he has agreements with both of them, and both positions do have helpful things to offer. But if you want to read more, I think this is a great and insightful book that he's written when you think about the topic of how God's law applies to today, to Christians today, and societies. And he has a whole end chapter on theonomy. And so, if you're interested, there's a book recommendation. All right. Well, as we close out this section, we should be reminded as Christians that we are to be those who love God's law, and we are to be governed by it. And this includes the Old Testament. We don't just look at the Old Testament and say, we don't like that. Reformed people, those confusing this topic might be, have not always agreed about how specific laws apply. But it seems to me that simply dealing with some oftentimes vague principles is not as helpful as going to a specific law, whether it's ceremonial, judicial, and looking at how does the general equity of this law apply to today. It's going to be more helpful than dealing with generalities. Then it would be more helpful to go to a specific text and try to apply it to today. All right, let's look at chapter 19, section 5, as we close this out here. It says this: "The moral law doth forever bind all, as well justified persons as others, to the obedience thereof, and that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in the respect of the authority of God, the Creator, who gave it. Neither doth Christ in the gospel in any way dissolve, but much more strengthen this obligation." Now, here in this last paragraph that we're going to look at, we see the abiding nature of the moral law. Again, we've highlighted this already. But the confession makes very clear that Jesus, as he did in the Sermon on the Mount, that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them. His job as the second Adam was to obey the law perfectly for us, in the sense that he fulfilled the law. But of course, as we also saw, he fulfilled ceremonial law, which was a type and shadow to his own person and work. And regarding the moral law, it not only remains binding for Christians and non-Christians, but with the coming of Christ, the confession mentions that he much more strengthened our obligation. Right? You remember Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Remember his many times he's saying, "You've heard that it said," and he lists the law, "but I say to you," and he strengthens it. He shows what not just the letter of the law is, but what the spirit of the law is. And so he even ratchets it up, or we might say clarifies, what the demand of true law-keeping looks like. Now, of course, this does not mean that Christians in any way look to the law in order to be justified by it. We don't look at the law, whatever the law, to be justified by it, but rather, as we talked about last week, the law is to guide us for holy living, to guide us for living as God has commanded us. This is the third use of the law. We look at the moral law not as a way to justify us, but rather we look at it, third use of the law, to grow in godliness. Because the glory of the gospel is that Christ has fulfilled every demand of the law on our behalf. He kept the law. We've said before that we are justified by works. They're just not our works. They're Christ's works as our mediator. And so as the law is no longer crushing and a burden to us, it is now a delight. As David says, it is sweeter than honey. So in short, we ought to never use the law, moral law, as a means of justification, but it does remain in place for our sanctification.